I think we need to start with the assumptions again. Let's start with those. Okay, so very first assumption is kind of stating the obvious, but I think it's just still important that it needs to be said. It basically means that whatever the network emits or issues as a reward is new coins coming into being. So that's basically how the coin supply grows. Right? There is no other way. There is no other way. There's no magical other way that coins come into being. The only way is through this rewarding for staking, and that's what resembles the growth, right?
Yeah.
I think it is important to know that it does not matter how much the staking percentage of total coins is, whether it's 20% of all coins staked, 50% or 70%. The actual reward rate, so the absolute number of coins being rewarded per time unit in this case, does not change.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is one of the important things, because Ethereum there, for example, does make a difference. Overall, when less is being staked totally, then they have less of a total reward, and if it's more people stake altogether, if not more people, if more coins as a percentage of total coins, let's say 70-80%, then there's also a higher absolute reward. More coins are being issued.
Mm-hmm.
It's important to understand that Nimiq does not chooses not to do that, for reasons that also came out of the research that have to do with the fact that Ethereum is doing this solely for the purpose of issuing, because of the way that they do that. They have like a square root function that determines how many coins are rewarded, depending on what the percentage of total coins at a moment is. It's basically a square root function that determines how many coins are being rewarded, and because it being a square root function, it's their way of making sure that in time, the inflation, let's call it, even though I don't like that term, but the coin inflation is decreasing. But anyhow, that is, I don't want to sidetrack. Point is, we are also looking to keep things really simple, simple and transparent, so that everybody can understand it. So there's a fixed reward rate per time that's being targeted, and it does not matter what the amount of coins as a percentage of coins in the supply of total supply are being staked. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Understood.
Yeah.
If you don't understand something, then let me know. I'll explain it differently. So it's really important that comes across. Number two, this is an important one. It's one of these assumptions and restrictions we're making in order to get a grip on this curve, is that we're looking for it to meet the same target that we had set initially with the first curve, the 21 billion NIM in 100 years from mainnet launch.
Mm-hmm.
We're 2 years in on April 14, which is kind of this demonstrational purpose time that we're using. It's going to be basically 98 years from this April 14th. And the idea there is just to say that, hey, we said in the first one that this is where we're going to meet our 21 billion final total supply, and we're going to do the same with the any adjustment, that it will also go there. It will at least touch that point, meet it, or cross it at that same point in time. That's the second ingredient. The third one is that we believe that it is the right thing to do to initially issue more than later on in the life of this coin. And this is just the natural logic of introducing something to a market. Even though you can't predict exactly adoption rate, you know that at least over the long run, levels of saturation are reached, which would be a reason to not issue as much later on than what you're issuing initially when you're trying to grow something, right?
Yeah.
So that's the third assumption.
Mm-hmm.
Fourth one is, there's this generally accepted economic ideal that in a monetary system, you want to make smaller changes and you want to make steady, you want to keep things steady. It's just part of stability. And right now, since our emission rate, standing at 29% annual growth, it changes very quickly. So it started, I think, somewhere at 60, 70%, and then dropped to 50, and now it's at 30%, and then it's going to be at 25. These are big jumps. First of all, they're the huge growth rates in and of themselves, and plus the way this growth rate changes is very big too. So just a general note that in point 4, in general, smaller, steadier rate changes are healthier. Fifth assumption is that the community expectation has been all along that the supply growth just needs to be smaller than it is at the moment. So we accepted that that's one of the things we want to adhere to, simply because the community has voiced this very strongly to date. So this is something taken into account. It clearly speaks against keeping things the way are. Number six assumption restriction, that we of course need to somewhat take into account what are other proof of stake reward systems doing out there. We should try to be at least reasonably competitive. Of course, you have to be careful because there will always be the ones out there that, just provide crazy high rewards on the surface by issuing a lot of a reward, but at the same time, that also means that the adjusted reward could be very low because all it's doing is issuing a lot of coins, but it's also growing the total amount of coins by this very large amount. So you're not really, the adjusted reward rate is close to zero, and you can see that when you do some comparisons on the project on something like I think it's stakingrewards.com or you know what site I'm talking about, right?
Yep.
So we basically, that was part of the analysis there, that of course we should fit into the range there, and specifically speaking into the range of the more reputable approaches in there.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
That was number 6, and at last number 7, that has the idea that a monetary supply, from a monetary supply point of view, it actually challenges the idea of having a finite supply, as we have designed for with the curve so far. There's a preference for a non-finite supply, means that there's, even if it's small, but some ongoing growth. That has to do with the fact that if this is really supposed to become a global currency and take over a good portion of carrying the global economy, well, the economy needs to grow, population grows, you need to accommodate for growth in general. And there's also the small element of coins getting lost, private keys getting lost. So there's an argument to be made that there should always also be a reward. So you take all this together, that hints in the direction of that it's not ideal to keep on having a finite supply. So those are the 7 main ingredients that are going into this what we've built here, or what we're looking at as a suggestion for this discussion. And in order to further kind of narrow in on something, what we're dealing with, we first established these 2 boundaries, which is a hardbound, that's the purple dotted line. I just realized that we gave them different names here. H1, let me just do that here. H1, first little inconsistency found. H2, and then I think called that S1. Let me see. S1 green. This is S2. Topsy, but okay. So the idea being that the first boundary is the upper boundary. That's just the one that we have right now. That's the curve, the way it's issuing right now. You can see that it has a very strong growth rate still ahead these next years, and yet at the same time, in a certain number of years from now, 5, 10 years, it already drops quite steeply, the rate of reward, and which would mean that also, as from a staking point of view, it would be very high rates in the beginning, and then they drop off very quickly. This is not not ideal. It basically, a lot of this first curve conflicts with several of the assumptions and restrictions that we made, specifically with 4, 5, and 6. 4 being the one that changes should in generally be smaller and steadier. Since this is such a steep and quickly changing curve, that speaks against that. It also speaks would conflict with the number 5, that the community expects a significantly lower supply growth. So not so many new coins coming into existence so quickly. And number 6 being that, comparing it to other proof of stake reward systems, this reward would be initially too high and later too low. So it conflicts with all of those. So that's why we could say this is, in that sense, an upper boundary. And then the lower boundary is if we were just to draw a straight line from this point through the target in 100 years or 98 years, considered a lower bound because it provides a very small comparative return at the moment. So it's kind of in conflict with the expectations of a competitive reward rate. It also has the problem that it does not really reflect the expectation of having initially higher adoption and later some level of saturation. So the problem would be that the growth here, the issuing of coin, of the growth of the coin supply would be too big in time later on, and too little in the beginning. So that's why this is the lower bound.
Yeah.
So from there, we moved on to try and establish some sort of a range that makes things interesting as a discussion point of what could we look at. We did a couple of things. One is that we said within this picture, we'd really like to also focus on what will happen in the lifetime in the time window and in the time frame of one human generation, which is about considered about 25 years on average, and that in combination with the competitive field of what the reward rates are elsewhere, in combination with all of the assumptions and restrictions made, we determined the most simple, reasonable approach to be one of starting with a certain NIM reward per minute, and then model it with a decreasing annual amount, and this would be a percentage that this reward decreases annually. But it really only has two parameters. The first parameter being what would be the reward rate at the time of switch to proof of stake, and the only other parameter being the annual decrease of that reward rate. Very, very simple, these two things. And we determined that kind of there's like two soft bounds. I mean, that's the tricky part. None of this is this is not a science. You need to somehow do some sort of an arbitrary assessment here, and that's why it's also an open discussion, and probably will result in some sort of voting or trying to pick something in the end. We established two approaches right now, one that starts with 400 NIM per minute at time of switching to proof of stake, the other one with 900. One with a relatively smaller increase of reward rate per year, 0.79%, 0.8%, and the other one decreasing faster, 3.1, 3.15%, which leads to these two curves, the green one and the red one. And then when you look at the columns here, the ones that you really want to look at are the reward per annum percentage, which is the one that you would be tempted to compare with other proof of stake approaches, stake projects. So in the red curve case, it starts at about 6.3%. Well, maybe it needs to be mentioned, but it's also important. This assumes right now that the only other parameter that's a parameter that does not affect the supply itself. It just affects how the reward percentage is calculated, because obviously the reward percentage is calculated based on what was staked. And so if we assume a 50% of coins of current coin supply being staked, then the red curve would result in about a 6.3% reward annualized. And if you correct that for what that means of how much you now own more after you're rewarded in comparison to how much the coin supply grew over the same amount of the year, then your return is still an adjusted reward of 3%. So that's for the red case, the lower soft bound, and for the upper suggested bound, it's 14% of reward and about 6.5% of adjusted reward in the first year. So basically the difference is that the upper bound is kind of more generous in terms of the reward in the beginning, but then obviously it decays faster, the amount of the reward, and by the end of the 25-year window, you see that in the one case where it comes down to 1.47%, in the higher reward case, sorry, to 2.99%, so around 3%, and the other one it's still above 3%. Seems like they're you know, after about 25, 30 years, they seem to cross. And after that point, the reward rate of the green curve annually is lower than the red curve. And that's simply because you're giving higher rewards in the beginning. So you're going to have to give, you're going to be giving less rewards in the long run. And this is tough to argue one way or another. You could say, yeah, if more growth is expected initially, if that makes sense from a competitive point of view, then a higher initial reward makes sense, just to attract also the staking. If you take a longer term view, then the lower, more conservative rewarding is the view to take. So it's really not black or white. That's what makes this whole thing.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, you cannot predict the future, or how
you cannot predict the future, and beyond, looking at 100 years is almost impossible. Looking at 25 years is also well, it's at least maybe somewhat more reasonable. The argument was made, and also in the article mentioned, that there will be fundamental changes even in cryptography. I mean, thinking of things like quantum computing, which might change certain elements of how the cryptography is handled, that could force anyone, including Bitcoin, to do hard forks. So this all means that there will always be an element of another opportunity to at that time then again consider any adjustments if they so make sense, right? So I think it's really about trying to find something that works, over a reasonably foreseeable amount of time, but also gives a long-term view that still holds up solid. So if you look at the curves after that initially designed 100-year window, you could see that the cap is exceeded. There remains to be some growth, but for example, in the case of the green curve, you could argue that it's really just a very small additional growth, and that would just help to keep the rewards working, and also counter some level of maybe token loss, so on and so forth. But it accommodates for growth nonetheless, fitting the economic approach there. So the big picture is still correct, and you could just see that in the red curve, it's just more aggressive in the long run. It keeps on growing more aggressively in the long run. It keeps on rewarding just because the percentage of decline of the reward is much, much smaller annually. So it's very tough to say, oh yeah, this is right or this is wrong. We can only look at this by comparative, in a comparative fashion. And what's nice about it is that we were able to reduce it to really two parameters. If you don't take into account the staking percentage, which really doesn't affect the growth of the curve in itself, that only affects the percentage calculated as the reward percentage calculation, but not the growth of the curve.
Yeah, is a per person, the entire supply.
But literally just where do we start? What's the initial reward per time unit? And what's the decline per year of that rate? And a suggestion by one of the community members, I'm going to just draw it for you. I'm going to replace the red one. You'll see what happens. Updates live. I think it was Rob who said he just somehow felt it would be an interesting approach to take these numbers, 525 and 1.47, which basically lifts the red curve up. It's kind of something where he took the red one and brought it closer to the green one. I'm not saying he went in between both of them, but you could kind of see. So he went from 400 to 552 nim per nim as a starting point, and instead of a 0.79% decline in annual reward rate, he's basically saying, suggesting a 1.47% decline in that rate.
Yeah, he's finding the middle.
And then that leads to an 8.25%. If you look at here, I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah, I can.
It went up from about 6%. Let me just see, was it 6? Yeah, from 6.3% to 8.3. Adjusted reward around 4% as a starting point, and then stays above 3% for quite a while here. Before the rates of reward between the green curve and the red curve
7 years almost.
cross in about 30 years also. Yeah, 23 years or something like that. They meet, and then the green curve drops. Green curve's reward drops below the red ones. Yeah, that's really, and then maybe one more thing to look at as a parameter to play with. The 50% is the percent staked, right, of current supply. So let's say let's say that this percentage goes down to 30%. Of course, that brings up, relatively speaking, a lot the reward percentage, because now that if you logically think very simple, less coins are staked, but still the same amount of new coins are being issued to those stakers. Obviously, that makes for a bigger reward, right? Reward percentage. So that is simple math. Obviously, all the math can be also verified by just clicking into the cells and looking how.
But that will be the one variable that maybe is the biggest assumption, because there's no way of that. That's the one we assume. Like,
well, that is also the one you end up using for the staking calculator. So once you kind of this is, I think, what if I understood Sven correctly, he will need us to at least pick one curve. So pick one set of these parameters and say, this is what we think is right now the most likely outcome of this conversation, let's just say. Once then he can feed that into the staking calculator, and then what the inputs are, without knowing this for sure right now, but I believe that the inputs into the staking calculator are then going to be exactly these variables. Some assumption that the user of the staking calculator can make about what they think might be, a total percentage of staking, and then they will, in addition to that, be able to add what their own stake amount will be, plus an assumption of how the price will change. Of NIM, if it's flat, or if it will grow, or this or that, and from that they can actually generate an actual prediction. But just to see how those numbers vary. So if it goes down to 30%, then obviously these reward percentages go up quite a bit. If it goes to, let's say, 70%, then obviously they go down somewhat. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I think the idea was these fields here are marked with green. Those are meant to be played with. The idea is, maybe that's a good thing to note, that these two are always supposed to be adjusted in a way where you're still crossing this intersection here, right? Because of this being one of the anchor points. So if I just went up to 600 here, I'm going to be above it. Right? So the idea is then that would mean I should I need to increase this percentage a little bit to bring it down until it crosses. I need to play around a little bit. Okay, 1.7, 1.8, 1.85. Here, now I'm back in the. That then it crosses at the 100-year marker, the 21 billion. So it's you could play with these variables in that fashion.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. That's very clear, very enlightening. And I think that will be helpful for the community to continue playing with it. And to remind everybody, there's a thread in the forum, so please share your opinion. We have been reading them every day, and we'd love for people to share even more opinions and more feedback for us to continue this discussion. So the link is going to be below in the description. Thanks to Elin for the detailed explanation. And yeah, I think that's very, very good, very clear.
I hope it helps.